This, I thought I'd give you today one of the questions on the exam. If you're too busy, you don't have, write it down, but this is a question on the exam. There is something that's very famous in science, not just anthropology, all of science. It's called the Piltdown hoax, where somebody, we're still unclear why. This is really a nasty, dirty thing to do to a paleoanthropologist. To go to a site, an archaeological site, and to put false evidence that the paleoanthropologist will dig up, okay? To salt, what they call salting the site with false evidence, so not that this information will come into light. And if people believe it, it'll be, misinformation in the field. It's like fraud and everything you want. And so this happened in Britain. And the thing that was discovered convinced people, and also because of the climate of the times in Great Britain, Britain was desperate to get its own fossil. The French had a fossil, the Germans had a fossil, and the British had nothing. They had the largest empire in the world and no fossil. And so when they found this fossil, early fossil of human remains of what we call the missing link, this is a phrase we don't use anymore. Okay? They were looking for the missing link. That's the creature that exists between the apes and us in the evolution from ape to us. Okay? So they had an assumption that there was one creature that evolved into existence before we did from the apes. And of course we know that there are many thousands and maybe millions of fossils of creatures in that evolution. Not just one, but that's what they thought at that time in Victorian England, that there would be one ape that looked more human-like, and that would be the missing link that hooked us up to apes. And of course, if anybody could find that fossil, it would be really, really big stuff, especially in England, which had no fossils of early hominids at all. Imagine having a museum the size of the British Museum, having all these paleoanthropologists, having looted Egypt, looted Greece for all their relics, looted Persia. You got all this stuff and you don't have a damn fossil of an early hominid. Not the Germans got Neanderthal, the French had Cro-Magnon, and the poor British had nothing. So they were ripe to be fooled. They were so desperate to get a fossil that they didn't look at the evidence the way they should have. And they jumped on it right away and of course it was a total fraud. And there's some candidates that we have for who was screwing who. There's a couple that today, but we don't know for sure how one of the biggest frauds, not just in anthropology, in all of science, it's so famous, the Piltdown fraud. But in understanding what they were looking for, what they thought would be the first characteristic in an ape that was looking like a human. What was the first characteristic that would evolve, which we don't think anymore, that we don't use the same definition, by planting evidence in that looked exactly like people thought it would look, they convinced them that it was true. And it wasn't until the 1920s, like 20 years later, that somebody actually looked at the fossil and said, God, this is a fraud. And not only that, it's not even a good fraud. So it sold the world, and yet it was all based on a conception of what was the first trait that would appear in an ape evolving into a human. And it was all wrong. And it was all wrong. Today we don't even think that. So it's good for you to know. Read a little bit on your whatever you have a computer attached to, through a phone or an earphone or whatever. And there will be a question on the Piltdown hoax. It might be when it occurred, where it occurred, and it's certainly about the false evidence. What was planted in the ground that convinced people? And what did this evidence indicate that would be the first trait that was in an ape evolving into a human? And this is called the missing link. And of course, nowadays there's no such thing as the missing link. It's the missing links. There are thousands of hominids between us and the apes 5 to 8 million years ago. Okay? And the reason I give you this ahead of the time when we usually cover this is so that when we get to it, you'll already understand the concept that it presents. And it also shows there is a lot of fraud in science. Okay? There's a lot of stuff, not just by pharmaceutical companies, but by everybody else. Okay? All right, missing links. Now, when we get to anthropology, cultural anthropology, we get into what most people are doing. And the idea is that anthropological study is holistic. If you spell holistic on the exam with a W in front of it, which actually makes better sense when you understand what holistic means, okay, it will be wrong. So never go for the holistic. If you see holistic on an exam and an A, B, or C, it's wrong. It's got to be without a W. Got that? It's an easy way I can make an A, B, C wrong. I can just put a W in front of it. And that should be something that's simplistic enough for you to remember. Okay, holistic is everything's in the explanation. So when we go to some culture, and anthropologists actually believe that the only way, or the best way, they don't always, we can't really study cultures that are past by going and living with them, because they're dead. Okay. We can study cultures today by going and living with them, and that's what anthropologists do. They live with the culture, and they describe it from within living with it. This is called participant observation. And nowadays, we used to only study cultures that were not our own. The idea is anthropology was aimed at other people in other cultures. Okay? Sociology was aimed at us. Anthropology was aimed at other people in other cultures. But people in other cultures are not really happy nowadays, some of them, that anthropologists come and study them. Because anthropologists get knowledge that can be used against the people who are being studied. And anthropologists have to be conscious of this. It's not all just you going out and furthering your career by writing a PhD or other papers on a group of people that are in a situation where they could be, exploited by other people. There's a lot of outside exploitation of people and cultures that are in the rest of the world. So what you have a tremendous moral dilemma when you go and study people, whoever they are, that the information cannot be used against them. And there's one standard rule when you go out to study people and they allow you to come in and live with them and record what's going on in their society. There's a rule that you don't get them in trouble. Anna, who teaches one of our courses, did a study on Northwest Coast Amerindians in BC. This is the word we use for Indian now. Amerindians. Columbus was wrong when he came to the New World and he called everybody Indians because he thought he was in Asia. Columbus was mostly wrong. Anything that Columbus said was usually wrong. Got really lucky. But what we don't know about Columbus is he already knew about the New World before he set sail. He worked for the Portuguese in the slaving industry off Africa, and there were Portuguese ships that had hit something way west and come back. They turned a little too far around Africa going home and ran into islands off of North America. So people in Columbus's day actually knew there was something. It wasn't just trying to prove the world was round, which is what they knew there was something out there, because Portuguese ships had actually run into it and thought, oh Christ, I'm lost again. How am I going to get home? You know, and to them it was a problem of poor steering. You know, they managed to get themselves way out, so far out in the ocean they hit the other continent, and nobody recorded it. They just thought they were off track. Okay, so the real name for Indians today is not Indians, it's Amerindians. I just thought I'd tell you that so you could be politically correct. Okay, Amerindians, these are American Indians. Okay, Northwest Coast Amerindians, many groups that were fairly complex groups along the Northwest Coast, because the resources in British Columbia along the coast are extremely rich. All kinds of marine animals. Salmon run like, you can harvest salmon every year as they run up the river. So it's just amazing sources of food. And the forest is also very rich with food. So you have a situation where they had very complex societies when the Europeans contacted them. And today, many of the Northwest Coast peoples are extremely rich because they live on huge sets of resources. Really quite interesting. Some of the better off Amerindian groups in Canada. And of course, you know, they make good goalies. Although they get injured now and then, and you know how the Montreal Canadiens fans are. They like to win every year, although it hasn't happened in a century. But you know, anyways. So she did her field work when she was doing her research. Field work. The field is when you go out to live with a group of people, or live near them and visit them regularly. She did her field work in the Pacific Northwest with a group of people. And at the end of doing her field work, which was to get her PhD at McGill, where she also teaches, Anna was struck with a dilemma, because when she took her PhD to the people she was studying, and she said, can I publish this? I know you are in land claims negotiation with the BC government, and you may be going to the courts and the Supreme Court to get what you want. All this is about you and your organization and your culture and the history of your culture. Obviously, it has information you may not want available to people outside of you to be used against you. Can I publish this? And they said no. So to this day, and that's about 10, 15 years, Anna does not have a PhD. And you get paid significantly more money when you have a PhD. She has a master's. And she did all the work on it. But she's a moral person, and to go to somebody who lets you come in and study them and then snitch on them, you know, it's sort of like not cool. It's just not cool, right? And she, fortunately, is an anthropologist that, you know, saw it and said, I can live without the extra money. These people were good to me, they allowed me in, and so on and so forth. And I think probably she's not too happy about the situation of lands claims and the fact that, you know, you actually are all living on Amerindian land, which you stole. Not you, okay, but somebody else stole, you know. So it's sort of interesting. When you talk, I remember many years ago when South Africa had an apartheid government which kept, you know, anybody that wasn't white in a place that was inferior. And the rest of the British Commonwealth was, you know, embarrassed by South Africa, although our companies were sending shoe factories there because they had cheap labor in South Africa. Canadian companies were more than willing to make money off of cheap labor supported by apartheid. I remember a South African getting up and saying, you know, you give a shit about this, about apartheid. You and the native peoples of Canada don't exactly have a great relationship, and actually you're all living on native land. And I thought, oh yeah, there is that embarrassing thing, yeah. We actually have not got a very good record. All the worst statistics and the worst things occur in native communities, in native areas. Poverty, poor education, all those things. And so we're actually at the moment where we're going to get rid of the Indian Act, which supported all that. It's going to be very interesting if Mr. Promises, I'm beautiful, Justin Trudeau, comes through, because we are 150 years way past when something should have been done about this. And so we're busy throwing money around the world like it's, you know, actually a real dollar when it isn't, but, you know, we're way past this. Yes?
If you're going to throw in the Indian Act, what happens to the Americans?
Well, I don't know what's going to replace it, so that's the question. Okay, but many people think it's actually a system of colonialism, and what has to replace it is something else. Probably more of a, you know, an equitable relation and what's it called? Something that the Indian communities Amerindian communities will agree to, rather than just get forced on them, you know, and that's the problem. Anyways, that's another course. But the Northwest Coast. So Anna had a decision to make, and the decision for her was straightforward because she's a moral person. You don't do that. And so we have people that go and participate and observe in communities of other people on the planet. Okay? And when they're participating and observing, they are recording what's going on. But they're looking for things like, what is their subsistence system? What do they do for a living? What is their social structure and political structure? Beliefs. Religion. And so by the time you write down all the things that anthropologists are studying, it's clear that it's holistic. It's studying everything. There'll be the history of the community, if there is one written. There'll be the prehistory of the community, which gets into archaeology and things that were written by other people about this culture when they contacted them. They'll get into all kinds, I mean, it's amazing where it can get to. Maybe some author in fiction wrote a book after contact with a group of people, and there'll be information about them in a certain period of their existence. And so you go on and on. The holistic part is that there's no such thing that's taboo for getting information. Genetic studies, everything else. And I don't think most social science disciplines do that. They sort of confine themselves to a certain level. When an economist goes in to study economics, they deal with what they see as economics. They don't deal with the other things that are going on around the economics. What an anthropologist will do, they'll go in and not only study the economic structures or the social structures or the political structures, the subsistence system, but they will see how this interacts with the other things in society. The belief systems, the kinship systems. And so when you come up with an explanation, it's on many levels, it's not just one. They'll also deal with contacts with the outside. Communities do not operate on their own, they're greatly influenced by outside. And you'll have to know a lot about the world around them and the context and what they mean. And it really is interesting. When you start doing these studies, you don't have any idea how many places you're going to go and how many offshoots you're going to get. So there's no such thing. I teach a course on Latin America and revolution. In teaching a course on Latin American and revolution, I've become an expert on the CIA, the American CIA, where they've been, what they've done. Okay? Not because I wanted to study the American CIA, but once they keep on popping up everywhere, you better understand what's going on with them, because then it begins to understand why the Americans define certain things as enemy, why they support dictatorships and so on and so forth, when America claims to be democratic. And so I teach a course on that, and we go where the information leads us, because if you want to understand why people are revolting and what they're facing and what's happened historically and all these other things, and I'll get students who say, "Sir, what does this have to do with anthropology?" And I'll go like, this is anthropology. It's all about human beings, and one thing leads to you don't get to a point and say, "Oh, that's not my field, I can't go there." There's a book I remember getting as an undergraduate, and it got to a point as to why poverty was created in South America. And the anthropologist, and I remember because he's a very good anthropologist, but he was an American anthropologist who was one of the top 3. And obviously by writing about what he knew about American interests in Latin America, he was going to start walking on the toes of people that gave out grant money to him and his students at Columbia University. Because this is how he snuck it in. He said, this is not the field. Looking at American interest in Latin America is not the field of anthropology, which is a lie. But he said that. And I thought, he's usually so good. Why is he saying it? And then he said, but if you're interested in this, look at my bibliography, these 2 sources. So actually he was putting it there, but he wasn't going to write it because he knew that would get him into funding problems with the people that give money to do research, you know. And it was really quite interesting. But there is no boundary. You just keep going and get the information. It's like a newspaper story. If something's over here and somebody says, well, that's not part of journalism, don't tell that to a journalist. All you're telling them is, it must be really good because you're telling me not to look at it, you know. And so, anthropology is holistic. If you're really doing anthropology, you don't know where you're going to end up. You could end up in genetic studies. You could end up studying some obscure field in something you never thought, you know, the study of insects. There may be something to do, the people that you're looking at, that the life cycle of a certain type of insect greatly influences because they do this, and you may end up being an expert on some bloody thing you never thought you were going to be expert on. Or ocean currents, or, you know, all these kinds of things. And so what happens is, what we're learning about ancient climates now, we're learning by putting core samples, pulling out core samples deep in the ocean, and in pulling out the soil that is settled in the ocean, we pull up all this information that shows the kind of pollen and vegetation that existed on the planet in a certain period. And it's perfect because it comes up in straight layering from the ocean. I mean, if you ever thought that you'd do geology, be looking at studies of geology on the ocean floor when doing anthropology, you know, it really is amazing where you end up. And when you do forensic anthropology, God, who knows, you're doing medical things, you're doing, you know, I mean, you've seen on TV when they say something, oh, we can tell how long this has been in the ground because this type of bug has had time to develop into this form in the body. And just, you know, things that you never thought you would ever look at. You know, I'm studying human beings. I'm not studying some obscure microbe that influenced human behavior 2,000 years ago. Okay? And so, it's a holistic study. It's everything. And actually, I think that's one of the things that I love about anthropology, is when somebody said, well, that's not it. And I go, what do you mean it's not it? It's tied to this, 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 and this, and this. And then you find out all kinds of other things. So what happens eventually is we are not just studying small societies. We're not just studying dead societies. We're not just studying other societies. And when you think about it, when we look at human behavior, what we are really looking for, even if we're looking at other societies traditionally, by looking at other societies, we can see things that we don't see when we look in the mirror. It is very difficult for us to believe that what we have been taught culturally is only one form of culture and there are other answers to the same questions. We think that all our answers are perfectly correct. I find it absolutely stupid as hell that Montrealers, okay, can't make a right-hand turn on a red light. I mean, it means you'll get killed in the sidewalk because everybody's going when they get that green light. The cars are going, they're not stopping. Screw the pedestrians. You're not safe in the side. You know, in Vancouver, if they don't stop, they're in deep crap. And they get to turn right on a red light, but then they have to look to make sure that there's nobody there they're running over. Okay? But I find the Montrealers and the Quebecers themselves actually think that they can't do that. The rest of the country's doing it, for God's sakes. They've been doing it forever. So I find it fascinating how cultural differences occur. And if you ask somebody, oh, we can't do this for this reason, the rest of the country's doing it. Yes? Yeah, I think outside the Montreal, for some reason, they don't trust Montrealers. I have no idea. Well, I think actually most of the country does it that way. It's just that Montreal, for some reason, has this whatever. I think it actually makes it more dangerous. No, I mean, I think we all jaywalk for a reason. We don't want to go across that crosswalk when it's a green light and the cars are coming. You're always looking, you know, Jesus, they're going to get me. Anyways, but that's just one small example. I mean, it's just like, oh. So there are things that we do that we think are right, and it can be the only way because of our culture. And when we start looking around the world, we begin to read, you know, there are 7 other different ways to do this. We never look at them. And when we look at different family organizations, we think everybody's organized the way our family. No, there's been a myriad of different organizations, different types of things, of way families have been organized because of local conditions. And they have all worked in some way. And so what happens is that we begin to view our existence as the existence of the rest of the people on the planet. We don't get it. We're actually odd in many ways. We're well off compared to most of the people on the planet. There are very few people in Canada, and we're all hugging a border. It's not like the rest of countries in the world. It's sort of, and there's all kinds of other things that make us kind of different because of the different things that we meet here. Also, we had relatives that were so, you know, they obviously read the wrong brochure and didn't want to go to Hawaii and live. You know, I don't know what they were thinking at the time. Oh, Canada, that sounds great. 9 months of winter. Oh, I can't wait. Let's go, eh? All right. So, holistic, and we now realize, what I find about studying anthropology is that by studying other cultures, which has traditionally been the focus, I begin to learn more about our own culture. Because you begin to start looking at your culture. Why don't we do that? Why don't we do this? And we begin to realize there's more than one way to do this. And that we're stuck in certain ways. And in fact, if we have to solve world problems, we've got to get ourselves out of the love with the internal combustion engine. Every time I go to the United States, and I think we're going to solve the problem of, you know, eventually to survive the problem of destroying the atmosphere, I look at the car in the United States and I just, you know, because you go to rural areas to drive to other areas, and you just, the whole system is based on that engine. You know, and they feed themselves with trucks going everywhere. It's just mind-boggling what would have to happen before that system was changed, you know. In any case, the whole reason to study humans is to understand the myriad facets of human behavior. Okay? What we are capable of. There's no, back in the 1700s, when in the Enlightenment, when philosophers who did no studying of people in many cultures, philosophers talked about the nature of human beings, what we were like, they would always veer, their human beings are not, are bad. Human beings are good. Human beings are this or that. And then they base their whole idea, well, we need very strong states because humans always are trying to commit crime. They're always, or other people would say, we don't. We need more looser states, more democratic states, because of course we tend to be, in the end, we tend to be self-sacrificing and good. Well, the point was, we are all those things. You can come up with, for examples of every kind of behavior possible. And what we know from anthropology, we will do what is necessary in many cases to survive. And so I'm not that negative on the world problem because, in the end, it may have to fall apart and a lot of people die. In fact, my current estimate, realizing the concentration of wealth on this planet in the hands of so few people, I think what's going to happen, we're not going to have to worry about the population problem. Not at all. The rich are going to take care of it for us. There's going to be a disease that's going to be let loose, to which they have the antidote, and they're going to kill off enough people to make it possible for them to go on living with what they have. There's no doubt in my mind, we've got the technology. And it's going to be one of those days and everybody's going to be getting sick. We're not going to turn into zombies. We're just going to go dead on arrival, and probably it's, it's going to be one of those things where most of us will not be around to remember. And I, having studied the whole thing, I think this is a likely case. Somebody's going to solve our problem for us. Because, of course, we're not solving the problem. And I don't think we're part of the solution, quite honestly. We don't have enough money and power. But that's my own personal thing, by looking at the problem as a whole and what's happened before. Okay? So, this is what we study, and it's amazing the information we've come up with. Okay? You are an extremely flexible animal. You have huge problems, though, weaknesses. For the same reason that you are so survival worthy, you have an imagination. It also makes you susceptible to believing almost anything. You'll believe, any fictitious theory that goes up about anything. You can abstractly see it happening. And it's usually the result of the fact that the physical solutions fail, that we begin to come up with solutions that are abstract and incorrect. Praying to somebody, believing in aliens coming to save us, or God knows what. But you have this amazing use of abstract thought to figure out things that we couldn't possibly see in science, but it also leads us down roads of supernatural beliefs and whatever, which can basically get us into serious trouble. So we're sort of very flexible, but our same strength is our same weakness. So I guess it's always the flip of the coin, as to which way we're going to go and how it's going to work out. In any case, anthropologists go into communities traditionally to live with the people, or they live near communities and visit the people regularly, and they write descriptions of what's going on in these cultures. Okay? And these are some of the things that they look at, but many of the cultures may have certain things that we consider unique. And so they'll spend extra time on a culture because they have something that may be noteworthy compared to most other cultures. For instance, if you were an anthropologist and you go and study the kinship system in a culture somewhere, it's more likely that it's more prestigious and more interesting, and you are more likely more hireable if you study a matrilineal society than a patrilineal society. Most of the societies or by far more of the societies in human existence have been male-dominated, with inheritance of property or use of property through the males. Okay? So the women marry into the family and they move. The men stay with whatever's going on, the farm, the logging business or whatever, and the women move into the community from different places. And the whatever property is passed from father to son to father to son, usually the first son gets the first option, or there's several sons divided up. And so matrilineal societies are much rarer, and so of much more interest to anthropologists because they are more unique. And so, also, if you were studying a society that was the source of, in Latin America, the source of religion, no, so the source of revolution, what I was studying. In Mexico, there's one community that's been studied by 5 different anthropologists over 100 years. It also happened to be the center of the Mexican Revolution. It was the area that a very well-known revolutionary, Zapata, a peasant revolution, Emiliano Zapata, Viva Zapata. He came from that area and he was one of the major participants in the Mexican Revolution of 1910. In the late 1980s and 1990s, revolution again broke out in the area because businessmen in Mexico City were illegally paying bribes to get Indian land that was in the region when the whole constitution of the Mexican country said they couldn't do it. And they were getting around it in the courts. And so the people revolted again and fought the Mexican army to a standstill. The same people that had fought under Zapata and of course they called themselves the Zapatistas in honor of the fact that this had been around. And so this is an area which is of interest to particularly political anthropologists because revolution was very current in the late 20th century and this was a hotbed for it. And there's no accident at 5 different, in the period from 1910 up to 1999, there were 5 different anthropologists in different periods that went to the center, to this one town that was the center, the hotbed, and lived there and studied what was going on. They all came away with slightly different opinions. But if you look at the 5 of them all together, read all their stuff, you begin to get a fairly good idea of what created the situation that led to revolution. Okay? And other things about the Mexican Revolution. And so, unique things, events that have occurred, so on and so forth, are places where, you know, you're drawn to them. You know, you may be an anthropologist that wants to go to some place in Arizona because it has, that place has more recent reports of UFOs than anywhere in North America. You may want to go someplace because the sightings of Bigfoot are so multiple that you want to study the town that's in the area to find out what's going on in the area with the humans, that there are all these sightings of Bigfoot. It's really quite interesting what you can do when you do the study. Unfortunately, usually you are limited by whatever source of money you are, because traveling and going and doing things cost money nowadays. And even though there's money out for research, you have to convince research people that whatever you're doing is worthy of being researched. But there's all kinds of things that people go and research. But by far the most common way to do this is to either convince the people that you should come and live with them, or maybe, rent a place in the area, or maybe if it's a town, just go stay in the town, or be close to them so you can visit them on a daily basis. So you get an idea. And the idea is if you participate in the culture, you begin to understand it. If you go to a culture and you ask the locals what a culture is about, they will tell you the ideal form. They will tell you how they are supposed to behave. And if you're an outsider, they're not going to tell you the naughty bits and the dirty bits, because that's how they really behave. Cultures have ideal ways, ideal behavior, but when you begin to live with people, you realize, okay, we are not following the ideals in all situations. And you begin to get a realistic appraisal of the human behavior and what are the causes. So, just taking at face value what people say, you know, when you come to me and tell me why you missed a class, you're giving me the, you know, the politically correct view for a teacher of why you missed the class. You're not saying to me, I couldn't fucking be bothered to come that day. You know, I wasn't feeling that well. There was my favorite is, oh God, don't become a teacher. My favorite is, I actually had a student who said this, and this is when I realized I should have no remorse whatsoever or sympathy when I'm dealing with students. As a young teacher, I thought, you know, people are kind of going to school because they're interested. I got a student who came up to me and said, sir, this is what I like, never say this to the teacher, although every student says it, and I wonder what planet they're coming from. Sir, are you doing anything important in class today? Oh no, we'd never do anything important. Why would we do that? Okay? And I said, well, of course we are. Why? Oh, I wanted to go home and watch the Beverly Hillbillies. I looked at her. She was serious. I go like, holy Christ. I mean, you know, that's what you get for asking the question. They kick you right where it hurts. I learned not to ask a stupid question. I really don't want to know why you missed class because it'll hurt my feelings so badly. Why would I ask you? You're so insensitive. You don't even know how to lie well, okay? So what we do in anthropology is we look for the real reasons for behavior in other cultures. And when we find it in other cultures, we begin to realize the real reasons we're actually doing things in our own culture. The real reasons. Because we don't want to admit that we're actually doing things for the reasons we're doing, because they may not be politically correct, or what your mummy told you to do, or what your daddy told you to do. Or maybe you're doing something that you shouldn't do and your friends shouldn't know, so you couch it in different terms. Maybe it's embarrassing that you show up this place so you can just get a look at that adorable person that you think is so wonderful. But you never want to admit that. I just happen to be here to get a book, you know. I come in here every day to get a book to see if I can see that person. But anyways, that's another story. So, participant observation. You're never going to really be part of the group. You're going to have to learn the local language. So you're probably, if you're an anthropologist, you're going to choose a language that you already speak. But in many cases, you're going to have to go and learn a language that is not a major language. It's not Spanish, it's not French, it's not Italian, it's not whatever. It's a local dialect, or even worse, it's a language that's not even written down in a book. Because people living in the tropical forest of South America do not speak Portuguese necessarily. They speak something like Guarani, the local native language. But the good news is you can learn that on the spot, and sometimes they do in certain countries have courses in it. But the best way to learn it is on the spot. And so, you get better and better at what you're doing. You get better and better. And when you do your first thing, that's usually the make it or break it. If you can hack the first set of field work with somebody, you might go on in the career. Otherwise, you'll end up doing other things. Well, you know what you end up doing? Writing about anthropology rather than taking part. Now, participant observation gets better the longer you live with the group, because when you live with a group, they behave in an ideal way around you in a certain way. And over time, they begin to relax about you and let down their guard and let you in. And some of them like you and some of them don't. You like some of them, and then, you know, it's like having friends. And so you begin to get to information you couldn't get to otherwise. So it's not an easy experience, but it actually is very rewarding because you get a slice of something you'd never get before. And I guess people who travel, you know, when people go on a holiday, one of the perks is you get to meet people that aren't, you know, the people from Canada where you live. You get to meet people who are different. And I like traveling in the United States because I find Americans different, you know. I like Vermont for some reason. I don't know why. I mean, there's rural areas in BC, and there's America below it, but Vermont is sort of an oddity to me for some reason. It's very Eastern American and things like that. I mean, I don't know if I live there, but it's sort of different. They slightly think differently, and so on and so forth. But anyway, so when you do this for the first time, you'll be doing it as a grad student. A graduate student. You'll be writing a thesis on something, and you'll be amassing information. These are called ethnographies. These are, I will read you, let's see. Okay, this one is the Igbo of southeast Nigeria. Went to live with a village of Igbo. And these are how the Igbo world, how they view the world. The Igbo, how they make a living. Helping the town to get up. Igbo ways in government. These are the subtitles. Founding a new family. Growing up in an Igbo village. The kinship network. Igbo hospitality. Non-kinship associations. Status placement amongst the Igbo. Igbo gods and oracles. So this will give you the idea. This is the Kapak, I don't even know how to pronounce it, Kapaku Papuans off New Guinea. Let's see what theirs sounds like. Okay? Economy, social organization, political organization, ceremony and spiritual life. Main characteristics. Fairly straightforward. These are the, looks like somebody that lives in some area near the Sahara. It's got a saber, a turban, and maybe riding a camel, can't tell. It's the Kaneru of Bornu. These are the titles of the setting, history, the family and household, the life cycle from birth to death, the economic life, the political organization. And so, what happened over the years is that we tended to study other people in other cultures. This was partially due to the fact that the Europeans had gone out and conquered peoples in the world and established colonies. The first anthropologists in the modern days were of two types. One type was a colonial administrator. So a lot of our earlier accounts of the natives and how they behaved were written in very racist ways by outsiders whose job it was to control them and exploit them. The colonial administrator. You tax the natives, you use them for cheap labor, you take their resources. But in order to do that, you have to understand them in a certain way so you can manipulate them. Because if you don't manipulate them, then you'll end up being in the same war that was caused when you conquered them the first time. I mean, one revolt against the British, what was the revolt about? The revolt was the rumors spread amongst Muslims in the British Army that the British were using pork fat in the bullets because you bite the bullet and take off the cover, and that they were using pork fat. And so one of the ways that the revolt was started was by saying that the British are doing this to us when we're fighting for them. And so, of course, the army revolted against the British. Okay? So administrators have to know this stuff. How to manipulate the natives. So obviously this is a very racist interpretation in early anthropology. The other one was missionaries. In Europe, most of these were Christian missionaries. How to convert the natives who have just been run over by Europeans, enslaved in some way, and turned into being exploited, how to take advantage of that. Okay, they've been run over, let's hand them Christ. You know, the belief that after death they'll go to heaven because they've been exploited, you know. And so the missionaries also had to start learning about native cultures. Some of the biggest sources of information come out of the writings going from missionaries back to their bosses. And a group that was really good at doing these things were the Jesuits. When I did research on Paraguay, in South America, I read a lot of Jesuit relations, stories by Jesuits who were living in missions with natives on what they believed, what they thought, how they did things. And this was a source for me for understanding earlier societies in Paraguay. Okay? It was totally racist crap. But within that, you begin to understand how the cultures worked. Okay? And another source is sometimes explorers. But explorers are only around enough, are not usually around enough with the locals to know much. They get very stilted views of people. They don't really stay with them long enough to understand their culture. Unless, of course, they're captured. Some of the best explanations of early American Indians cultures, Amerindians, are people that were early explorers or fur trappers that got captured by the locals, were forced to live with them, and when they left or escaped, they were able to give some kind of explanation of how their cultures worked. Okay? And so it was actually like being an explorer captured, or a fur trader captured. It's like sort of being an anthropologist and you got the door wide open because they captured you. So you get the information that anthropologists sometimes are denied. Okay? Now, local societies got clever. They realized that the rest of the world, the Europeans, were out to control them and exploit them even in the modern day. Even countries that send you aid, a lot of the aid is very suspicious. You know, if we send tractors to somebody, we say, we're going to give you aid in Canada, we're going to send you tractors. These people may not need tractors, but we insist on our aid is coming in tractors. What do we want to do? We want to get rid of the tractors. We don't want to have to compete with Russian tractors, which are cheaper, so we'll put them in the aid package. 80% of aid is not free. It's loans. So a country, in order to get the aid, has to take whatever's in the package, so we get rid of the tractors that are not as cheap as the Russian ones, and people get in debt to us. They may not even need tractors. Then when you send them a technology of tractors, they need the technology to keep the tractors running. Now you got spare parts being sold. And so you have to be very suspicious of how we are helping people out, because sometimes we're more helping out the people who build tractors and parts than we are the people who are receiving the aid. Also, if you need a tractor and you can use it, you're probably not a poor farmer in any country anyways. You're probably one of the rich farmers that's using all the major land to grow things to sell to other people outside the country, not food for the people in the country. So it goes on and on and on. When we give aid, it's a very suspicious thing how this aid operates. Okay? And so these people know that very often outsiders are not there for their own good. And many communities refuse to take in anthropologists now. Why should they? In the early days, they would have been forced by the local government under pressure. And so now when anthropologists go out, it's not doors open all over the place. There's some very sophisticated people in the world who say, hey, no thanks. An anthropologist? No, thank you. Why would we want people to expose what we're doing and everything about us? Okay? And so, in the last part of the 20th century, we have been forced to study ourselves. People who are disadvantaged in our country, who are forced to take anthropologists in. So we go back to smaller units. We study schools, we study workplaces, we study things like Tim Hortons outlets. I'm not making this up. I had in grad school at McGill, there was a female who was, she needed money, she didn't have a grant, and she wanted to study something that she'd get her master's easily, so she went to work at a strip club. So she was doing the study at the same time she was making money. So, you know, it actually seemed to be quite a logical, if you had no moral problems with it, why not do it? And of course, at that period, there were a lot of strip clubs in Montreal. Are there many around nowadays?
Yeah, there are.
Seemed like, you know, I remember one time, I used to be teaching at the prison of P9, right? And there was this hamburger place, and it said hamburgers, you know, what was it, $1.19 or something like that. But it was all closed off. It had been a drive-in, but it was all the windows were closed off. And I thought, oh, I've got to get a quick burger. And I go walk in, it was topless. I thought, it's a topless, you know, cheap hamburger place. I just wasn't ready for that. I just thought, that only in Montreal, you know, you could get a topless, cheap hamburger place. Anyway, I happen to have come from a very uptight place in the world. Believe me, British Columbia was extremely uptight, politically and morally. So it was like, to me, it was like, wow, I never thought I'd ever see this. Could you pass the mustard, please? Okay, so what's happened is we've been forced back into studying things around us. So you have anthropologists going to a school. They'll write a study of an elementary school class, an elementary school. They'll go to a barber shop, and they'll sit out there and they'll some way begin to see how it works. They'll go to the shoe floor in the bay, and they'll work in the shoe floor, and they'll figure out all the things and the myriad operations, and that'll get them at least through their masters. They'll go to, you know, you name the institution, and it's possible. You could do a class here, you could do a department here, you could do all kinds of things. And so they've been forced back on our culture for political reasons, and they're now doing studies that are local and being funded for that. Because the studies outside, people are much more cautious about allowing foreigners in to learn things about them, which could be used against them, because it's created exploitation in the past. Yes, you're going to have something?
Yeah. Could an anthropologist just study, like, Montreal, like, big cities?
Well, the problem is, when you go to study something, you need to be in a study. You're going to visit a group of people every day to see how the operation works. You're going to compare it against what they say they're doing and what they're not doing. You're going to have to know everything about the people. So, one anthropologist cannot study a unit the size of Montreal. It has to be something small enough. So I would say the smallest thing you can study is a village or town. And it can't be too big. Village or town. Can't be too big. And it can only be when you do a study where it's basically descriptive. It's called an ethnography. These are all ethnographies. Ethnography. You are collecting data, descriptive. Collecting data on a certain thing, a cultural entity. So, the unit has to be small enough for one anthropologist, one ethnographer, to go and study and actually get a good view of what's going on, or a small team of ethnographers to do it. They may divide the study up, okay, and put it together and have the whole unit. Ethnography means a picture of an ethnic or cultural group. It can't be as large as a city, it has to be a town and village, or village at the very most. It can't be a whole, you don't study Walmart in America. You study Walmart on Decarie and what is it? I don't even know what the cross street is up. Decarie and something, at the Decarie Shopping Center. The Walmart at the Decarie Shopping Center. And so an ethnography is small. This is good for you to know because you are going to have to give me, on the exam, which I'll explain to you, the title of an ethnography or an ethnology. You don't know which one you're going to get, so you're going to make it up ahead of time, and that's what I'm going to explain to you next day. Okay? And I will hand these out to you again so that I intended to hand